My company is MP Benefits, and what I am is a group benefit consultant. I work with companies to create strategic employee group benefit plans. Culture is so important in what I do because benefits is the promise kept from an employer to the employee that there will be coverage there when they need it, as they need it. And so I've taken a deep dive this last year into meeting and curating conversations with people who are in the culture know. And I was so pleased in February to be part of Jolene's Culture Month, and where she interviewed so many amazing people. It was changing for me as a professional and so an eye opener for a lot of different perspectives. Take me through a little bit about you, how you get started in going down this culture road, where you started coaching people, how that all came to pass.
Thanks for having me on today. It is getting interviewed. Well, I used to avoid media. That was my goal, was not to get quoted. So that was my goal in life. So for me, I started working with organizations. I'm a professional facilitator. So work that I was doing was, when I started my career, was facilitating and working through, I worked for the city of Calgary. So working through some public consultation and facilitation attached to different things, and then ended up working in other organizations where I facilitated. I have a background in communications as well. And throughout my career, the culture component has been there. And before I became a consultant, I was in charge of really designing and evolving a culture in an organization where we were shifting. We were shifting the productivity of the organization, changing how the employees would look at the organization. And that really kind of set me to continue my culture path. Before that, normally I would be the one in the office world of creating the culture. I used to have a candy jar on my desk. And when I worked at the city, we had two teams that worked side by side, and there was a divide, not joking, in the middle of this. And it was like crossing into another realm on the same floor. And the floor wasn't that big. And I would have a candy jar on my desk so that people would interact and come across the floor to talk to each other. So that was kind of where I started, and that evolved from there into my own consulting firm for over 9 years now, working with culture and communications. So I help teams and leaders and companies design culture is what I do. And communications is a huge part of that. And the work that I do. So you can't have one without the other. So they go hand in hand. And I work with mostly medium to large organizations, although I do work with some smaller organizations. Smaller organizations have just a different way of evolving their culture than medium to large do. So it's a little easier, I find, because when you don't have as many people, your culture can change fairly quickly with what that looks like. So I do culture assessments, employee journey mapping. We do culture design, team and leader workshops, and team and leader development is what I work on.
A lot of your experience or your motivation in getting into this field was the employee experience. Is the divide, sometimes a very great divide, especially in government situations, between the expectation and the boots on the ground reality. How do you apply that knowledge of what you learned in a government office to that private sector? And is the divide as great in the private sector, or is it not?
I've worked in government organization, public organization, and private companies, so associations. So I've worked, my background in my employee journey has been very broad in those pieces. I think one of the challenges government organizations have is they have to be fiscally responsible. And so employee development, especially when I worked there, that was I started at the city like 21 years ago. So it was a long time ago, where the employee experience and spending money on employee development, it was a tight budget. It happened, but it was a tight budget. And that's evolved over time. And I think from public and private organizations, I think they all struggle with something different in really understanding how the employee experience shapes their culture, shapes their business goals, and how they're able to achieve those things. And that's really one of those things when I work with organizations that are really paying attention to that. That's where the uniqueness is. I think there are a lot of organizations just moving along and they're doing well, as well, and they're not really thinking about culture. And it's surprising to me how often I go into an organization and I sit down with the executive team and we have a conversation about culture, and it might be the first time we've talked about it. They may not have ever talked about it before or thought about it in that way. They think, oh, that people stuff. Here's some money. Let them go get training, go develop some skills, versus let's think about how this impacts our brand and reputation, how this impacts the targets and goals that we set, how this helps us achieve our vision and mission. And it's not something where they talk about what is that ideal employee experience or culture look like.
They talk a lot about employers will say things like, that's the soft stuff. We're concerned with the hard currency. I love your example of the Mona Lisa. Let's talk about that. I know, you're going to have a fantastic book at some point.
Yes.
And I love the example of the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, so it'll be called The Frame That Holds the Mona Lisa. So the Mona Lisa, of course, shines, right? That's what everybody goes to the gallery to see. And they want to see the Mona Lisa and the extraordinary painting that it is. And so I often describe the Mona Lisa as the high performer in your organization. And we don't always need high performing employees, right? High performing teams, yes, but high performing employees. So is the frame a high performing employee? Or is it an employee that does a really good job holding the Mona Lisa, right? Same thing with the lighting, same thing with the people that clean up the gallery, all of those pieces. Can they be high performing? Yeah, you probably don't see any garbage in the Louvre, right? It's a pretty clean place. But the frame itself is doing its job, and it's doing its job well. And that's sort of the idea that if you want all your employees to be high performers, you're going to have a big challenge, because high performing employees demand a lot. And why do people always have to be high performing at work? They are likely high performing somewhere else in their life. Everybody is a high performer. It may not be, they may like to come to work. They may like their job. They get their job done well. Why do we have to bump them up to be more than that? And I think that's where I really think about organizations where we not only need to pay attention to the Mona Lisa, we also need to pay attention to the frame and make sure the frame has what it needs in order to shine in its own way.
I think a good example is a company that will spend a lot of money to attract this high performer, to get that person into the organization, to create that return on their investment. And then when they get the high performer in there, what do, Jolene?
They give them a C. So performance, I could go all day about performance ratings and what it does for employee experience and employee morale in your culture. And we track these high performers, and these are people in their world that are getting A's their life, right? Like that's their expectation, is they get an A. And they come into an organization, big promises are made to them about expectations. And then there's the forced ranking that happens with a lot of performance pieces. And there's a lot of folks on the call today that know and work with people that have the performance ratings. So you have to get bucketed. So you get 10% in A, a good chunk in B, a good chunk in C, right? And then the D's are the performance, people who need performance improvement. You may have a ranking system 1 to 4 or whatever it is. So there's people who have they've been given A's all their life, now get into a forced ranking and they get B's and C's. And that's a really big challenge, right? Is if you want to talk about employee morale or drive, that's a great way to crush it, right? Is to give somebody a C. I remember having a conversation with a colleague of mine super high performer. He was a consultant, super high performer, did an amazing job. And the company was like, come work with us, come work with us for 2 years. The organization was like, work with us, work with us, work with us. So he's like, yeah, there's lots of great stuff going. I'm going to join this company. And he did. And he got a C. He got a C in his performance rating. And I'm like, holy moly. So he lasted not that long, became a consultant not too much time later. But it was a really big deal from a piece from a force ranking perspective where leaders like their people, or you have executive teams fighting for their teams, and some executives don't fight as hard. And so there's all this churn that happens into an organization. And so that performance piece is a challenge. And if you want to talk about how you create silos and individualism, do performance ratings, right? Do them on individual basis versus a team basis. I'm not saying you can't have both, and most companies need to have both instead of just individual performance. And so how do you also reward performance outside of money, right? Outside of the bonus that people get? There's a whole bunch of other things, obviously from a recognition perspective, where we can bring employees into the space where they feel like they're valued. And at the end of the day, that's what employees are looking for. It always comes down to value every single time.
Absolutely. Richard Haddon writes a lot about that discretionary effort. And I think that is the goal that we want from all of our employees, is for them to believe and want to believe in our organization. And one of the ladies that you had interviewed, she said it really succinctly when she said, we're hiring people to make us a profit while we're not giving them a profit. You know, and that comes to that discretionary effort. How do we achieve that discretionary effort if we're putting people in these silos?
Yeah. Well, and I think the one of my favorite conversations that we're talking about right now is I'll often have an executive team say, okay, Jolene, we want our employees to take ownership of what, right? What do they own? What have you given them control over? What is their authority? What does that even look like? And we want people to have that discretionary effort, but what does that really mean? And what does it even look like? I think is where we need to start is, so if somebody's in the office from 8 to 5 every day, is that what you're looking for? Or what are you looking for? Are you going above and beyond? So what has given the passion for them to go above and beyond? What has driven them to feel like somebody values them so that they can go above and beyond? And is that what you're looking for? So I think really starting with that conversation is it's my favorite thing, because it comes up almost every single time, is we want to create owners. And they don't really know what that means, and they haven't really defined what that looks like, and what are even the behaviors that you want to see, and what is enabling those behaviors and what's blocking those behaviors, because chances are pretty good you've got a whole pile of blockers. And it's I said this to Lori, there's always this wall that happens. It's the middle level management, right? Where something comes and it hits the wall and then it slides down gracefully onto the floor, right? That's the beautiful part, is if you have this great vision as an executive and you don't get your managers on board, and you give them the how to do it, because they don't know how to do it, how can we actually create and establish that? Because those leaders are the people that see their employees every single day. That's where the discretionary effort comes from. That's where ownership comes from, is from the leader leading them and providing that value, feeling like they're valued by that leader and by their team too.
Natasha and I had this conversation. She said it really well, that they have in building that culture within her organization takes that work and effort and intention, if I may. And now they are advocates. You don't have to work as hard, where your people are now of their own discretionary effort being those advocates for the company.
You know, it's happened really organically in terms of us, you know, building our culture up. And we have such high engagement with our employees that what we've actually started to notice now is, you know, we have we have buy-in from our employees. And so then we have, new employees that are starting, and you can see them being culture, ambassadors for us, right? And they're saying to the new people, this is what we do. And, oh, this is great. We have happy hour Fridays, and, oh, stick around for, it's, we have these great annual parties, right? So we did this Mexican, fiesta night for an annual party, or, if you do this, you get this. And, they start sharing with the new employees and the staff about all the great things that we do to take care of our family, right? All of our staff members. And that, with the new staff, starts to build engagement, and I want to stick around, right? It helps build our retention. But you're right, Laura, like I don't have to, it makes my job a lot easier because I have, what I call culture ambassadors within our organization.
To that point, that's a great segue, because Barney had mentioned before we had started that this pandemic has opened up a great window of opportunity, but that window might be closing. And Jolene and I had spoken about what does it say about an organization on how they have treated those ambassadors this last year and a half, on what that's going to mean going forward. You had some great examples.
Huge. Well, I think there's going to be more examples than this, but there's companies who maybe had an okay culture, went remote. For the most part, they may have had field staff that still had to maybe touch base at an office or be around, that weren't working at home. They were working out in the field. And they went through this pandemic. They might have increased their communications, may have increased the rapport of the company. Some organizations didn't do much. Employees are like, it's normal for us to not do this. And other companies may have had an incredible culture and gone to remote work, and the communication just went sideways, right? Like being involved. And so what's the biggest challenge, I think, for an organization that has really loyal ambassadors to their company, showing up differently in the remote world has just clobbered trust, has absolutely changed an employee's point of view to how they look at their organization. So it's even worse if you had a great culture and you went remote and you didn't have that communication and building rapport and the intentional side. And that's the big piece, the intentional side. If they didn't have that, then things have just gone really poorly and are going to go really poorly for them. Organizations that have had a great culture and have kept it up throughout this time are going to see their employees to still be loyal. They're not going to be the 40% of employees who are looking for a job right now. They're going to have people want to come back. I think the bigger challenge now is going to be, there are companies that have already gone back to the office. I had a client yesterday say, Jolene, what's interesting is now we're back in the office for the past week, and not everybody's back, but the leaders are back. It is amazing what shift has happened. So how it's like we've had the momentum of communications remotely, but now we're back in the office. It's like we've gone at lightning speed to kind of building back that trust and rapport. And I think a challenge with companies going back to the office, and this is going to be an interesting take, is I love the conversation that I do think it's a giant opportunity for organizations to refresh and reinvent. I absolutely think it is. And the window is absolutely closing. One of the biggest challenges that's going to happen is the hybrid workforce. When it comes to employee experience, 100% is going to be challenging. So I equate it to the smoke doors, right? So remember back in like the 80s when people used to smoke in the office. I wasn't in the office, but when people smoked in the office, they would go down to the smoke doors, and that's where decisions would be made, right? That's the same thing that's going to happen in a hybrid world, is that if we don't remember that there are people working remotely and we only care about the people in the office, we're going to have a struggle with keeping people engaged and motivated. And so it's really about designing what is the employee experience when we have a hybrid workforce. How can we create this same employee experience? It doesn't mean we do the same things. It means the intention is the same. So companies like Google, who had a whole bunch of their employees leave Silicon Valley, are now doing hubs within the community where they're involving the community. They're not with teams. They're more of a group of employees in the same location that go to a hub, creating that employee experience that's going to be the same in that hub, even though how they connect in, how they engage with the community, how they engage with each other is going to be different. But it's an intention around it, is how do we bring in those people in the same way and treat them with the same intention so that they still feel part of the organization and not like the world is passing them by because they're not in the office. And then they feel now, okay, now I have to scramble and figure out how can I be in the office all the time because I'm missing out. So that fear of missing out is absolutely there. And the engagement piece is going to be very different. It's really easy to engage somebody walking down the hall. A lot more intentional when you engage somebody virtually. And so that's where a plan comes in, right? That's where the design of the employee experience comes in, and the opportunity, I think that was mentioned at the start of how can we do that as we head back into the office? You know, people are trialing it in the summer, they're heading back in the fall, probably in a staged approach. What does that look like? And I think about at the Spotlight on Culture that Lori mentioned earlier in February, Chris Good, he works at One Workplace. I loved what he said about the workspace. He said, no longer is it a backdrop inside of the story. Your office is now a character in the story. And really thinking about what does that space look like and how do we interact with it, especially if we're going to continue to have physical distancing in place, if people are going to need to wear masks in the space. What does the kitchen even look like and the interaction in the kitchen? And a small, tiny little thing. So Ken Limacoelho, who works with the YMCA Calgary, the idea of the signage that you put up and how that interacts with your internal brand, even your external brand, but the idea of how can you make it something that attaches to the employee experience versus stay 6 feet apart because you can't be closer together, right? Something very generic and bland. How can you create that space in the experience so when people are coming into the office, they have that experience, and when people are outside the office, they have that experience as well?
I think too, you hit on a really good topic that Melanie and I were just speaking of this week. People are over, I should say, being dictated to. I don't think anybody ever likes to be dictated to, but because the expectation, like you said, the office is now part of that character in the story, is to give choice and flexibility. Like you've been given three choices. What's going to work for you, understanding and respecting that you are a productive member of that team.
Yeah, so they just actually released to us 3 options to all employees. One being a hybrid model, one being a full-time in the office model, and one being a 90% remote, with the expectation that when there's all staffs or team meetings that you'd be expected in the office. And then obviously having performance tied to that there may need to be changes if your performance isn't where it should be. But now is where they're starting to map out what does that look like from an interaction standpoint so that all 3 options are supported the same way. So they're starting to make good moves, I think. I think everyone felt really, like myself included, I was telling Lori before, I have 3 children and I used to drop them off early at daycare, be in the office long hours, and that was what I was used to. And now being home, I get to hear about my kids' days. It's a different mindset of what you realize what you missed out on. So I think choice will be important.
It puts you in that control seat to make that decision based on your information that is particular to you.
Well, and I think that's where that value comes in, Lori, is we're valuing you as a person, and we're valuing that you are more than a being that comes to work, right? You have more to life than just what we see on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's where it's going to be interesting. I have some predictions, but from a leadership perspective, people who are leading the different, so to Melanie's point, 3 different scenarios with their employees, what will happen with leadership? I know that we saw like the micromanagers had to give it up, right? They completely had to give up micromanaging because there was no way to do it well remote in any way, shape, or form. And some of it were like, oh, people are doing, and there are others I'm curious to see if that old habit has been broken, or when they get back to the office, because it's in that space that they're used to, if that old habit comes back up. And managing different people in different scenarios is going to be how they're going to deal with it, and how they're going to really be intentional about interacting with employees and how they're going to feel about them, and how that shows up with their leadership. Is there going to be favoritism? There maybe.
That's a tough one, right? There's Harvard Review, Business Review has written about it. The Economist has written about it. The Financial Post has written about it. The Economist had released an article, I think last week, where they were, and when we're talking about discretionary effort, employees who are working remotely are giving that extra effort, but they're not, according to the article, they said they're not as efficient, I guess is the right word to use. I think we have to recognize that if they're working extra hours, they're doing that as by choice. If they weren't as efficient, they could have been equally inefficient within their 8-hour workday. Yeah. But yet they've given all of those extra hours in order to get the productivity moving because they obviously believe in what they're doing. So I think that there's two ways of looking at these stories. Yeah. What do you see? I'm really curious as to what people are seeing and what are some of the real positive things and innovations that you're seeing come around.
So Melissa has a question in here. Can you comment on the organizations that want to move forward, move back to normal? Good luck with that. Have acknowledged options, but aren't living the impact realizations that we've come to over the personal and professional. I think so. Organizations probably don't believe this is true, but the statistics show us that there's a good chunk of employees looking for a new role. And if they're not getting options from their employer, so the move back to normal, if they're not getting those options for remote work, hybrid work, or whatever it looks like, they're going to look elsewhere, because the piece that employees have had right now, they've had an experience. So they have now an experience bias that exists inside of their brains, that there is a different way to work. So any organizations that were, I think about a friend of mine, she ended up retiring early because her organization wouldn't do remote work. And then the year later, the pandemic happened, right? And it proved that it could happen. And that's what you're going to see, is that if they don't realize that employees have had this experience bias, you're going to start to see shifts. And I think the ego that gets in the way of organizations is, well, the market's not that great. Oh, people can find another job. There is no doubt about it that they can find another role with an organization that gives them something. So I think they're going to have a wake up call if they want to move back to normal, and just they need to realize that leaders, if the move back to normal is inside of their head, they need to realize they've had the experience too. And if you get the executives or whoever the decision makers are to have the conversation about what has worked well for you, not the company, you, what has not worked well for you, what can we do with our employees? And think about, it's 10 times different. It's a different experience for people who are frontline versus an executive. Executives, unfortunately, are out of touch with the organization. It's not their job to know what goes on day to day. It's their job to look at the vision and the strategy. And yes, they need to know how the culture is brewing, and they don't see it every day because that's not what they do. That's not what their role is. So really bringing those trusted advisors around the table, I think, is going to be important. And for me, I would elbow my way into that room, because from a brand and reputation perspective in particular, organizations that haven't had the realization that there is a different way to work and we can do something different are going to be left in the dust. They just are. Unless you're a giant corp, even then you're going to see massive transitions in teams because of the ability to really create an experience that employees want to have. There is more to life than work, and people have worked from home, right? So they've blended that experience, and for the most part have done it pretty well.
Even big companies like JD Power and Associates, the way that they even have their sales team structured now, the word on the street is they're not even doing cold calls anymore. It's all virtual. It's all via LinkedIn and the social media. They've invested in massive amounts of training to accommodate this new, and they did that by first asking the employees, what's going to work for you based on this scenario? And this all came because they couldn't reach anybody, when they were making the calls. So last word is yours, Jolene. Where do we go from here, and how do we continue this conversation, and how do I pull you back in the fall to do an update when we are in this hybrid scenario?
Well, if I'm okay to do it in the fall, so something is being planned for September about how to lead in a hybrid world. So leading in that virtual world. So not as crazy as the 20-day summit in February, but just as helpful, I think, for that. And watching for what might come up with that, and getting some of those experts and the different voices to really talk about how do we engage people in hybrid, or even back to the office as people start coming back in the fall. And so that's what's coming for me. And I think the biggest thing to leave it with is just be intentional about the experience you're creating and the culture that you're creating. The door is open. Take advantage of it and walk through.
Oh, I love that last word. And speaking of keeping engaged, I hope that you liked coming into the room today and sharing in the conversation, that you have enjoyed coming in. I hope to see you again soon. And do make a commitment to have a virtual coffee with somebody you've never met before. So thanks everybody for coming in. You always make this the very best part of my week. And I hope you guys have a great weekend, and that the weather shines wherever you are.